The focus of my talk is going to be on Kierkegaard's views of love, specifically in works of love published under his own name. Now, the main topic of works of love is what Kierkegaard calls neighborly love, which is a kind of love which is supposed to be specifically Christian. There's supposed to be an ethical requirement that this kind of love be present in all human relationships. And this kind of love is not a passion in the way that erotic love might be. Instead, it is an unconditional moral duty that is owed to all human beings by all human beings, entirely apart from any personal inclinations of the lover or expectations of reward or reciprocation. And so the big question that has dominated discussion, or at least the discussion that I've read of Kierkegaard's works of love, is how can Kierkegaard make room for preferential love? How can preferential love, or more specifically perhaps, how can there be relationships of preferential concern, like those you would have towards, say, your own children as opposed to someone else's children? How can that kind of love or those kinds of relationships be reconciled with the moral requirements of neighborly love? And there are two main reasons why there's a tension here. And both of them came up in indirect ways in the last two presentations we had at this workshop. So the preferentiality inherent in preferential love and the equality or egalitarianism or non-discrimination involved with neighborly love seem to be diametrically opposed. More specifically, the reasons why there's a conflict are, well, I give two here on the slide. There may be others, but I think these are the main ones. The first one is that preferential love seems to at least run the risk of being a disguised form of self-love. When we love someone for characteristics that we prefer, then that at least runs the risk that we will be blind to the concerns of, or we will exclude the concerns of those who do not share those characteristics. And that would seem to conflict in quite a strong way with the various things Kierkegaard says in works of love about not making distinctions between persons. Then there's an additional problem that in some relationships of preferential concern, we may not wind up with the ability, we may not wind up with distinct individuals after all. This is what I call person fusion on my slide. That's a kind of weird term for it, but Jamie Ferreira summarizes the issue, I think, pretty well. She says, there is not only the danger of moral blindness to others when we preferentially love one person, but there is also the danger that our preference can so reduce the beloved that there is no vision even there of a genuine other. And this is exactly the sort of thing that happens in some of the love relationships described in Kierkegaard's pseudonymous works, which we heard a bit about in the last two presentations. So it's pretty clear that Kierkegaard wants neighborly love and relationships of preferential concern to coexist. He often speaks of loving people in their individual distinctiveness. He talks about personal relationships as being further expressions of neighborly love. And he even talks about virtues which are proper to erotic love and friendship. But as John Lippitt observes, and I think we'll be hearing from him tomorrow, he says, it is one thing to acknowledge space for preferential relations, but quite another to show how this preservation is to be performed. And I agree, that's a big issue. An additional wrinkle I want to add to that issue is that, so we make room for preferential relations, then we have to show how they're to be performed. And then the third piece I want to add is, given that this is Kierkegaard, we want to show how those preferential relations can have a distinctly Christian character, because that seems to be something that Kierkegaard would want. And so this debate about how to reconcile relationships of preferential concern with neighborly love has revolved largely around the two questions that I have here on the slide. The first one is Kierkegaard committed to ethical ACOSMISM? What ethical ACOSMISM means is that that your love is indifferent to the object. Nothing about the distinguishing characteristics of the thing or person loved matter. It's not that you could replace the beloved with something else entirely, and it wouldn't change anything. And there are passages in works of love which suggest this. There's one passage where Kierkegaard basically says that the law of neighborly love could be practiced even if you weren't in the vicinity of any other persons. If you were alone, stranded on a desert island, you would still be able to practice the law of neighborly love. And then the second question is about one specific part of how neighborly love and preferential love relate. Is one a type of the other? Is one a further expression of the other? Are these two different kinds that just have to coexist in a certain way? How do we cash that out? Okay, so regarding the question of ethical ACOSMISM, I'm going to spend comparatively little time on this point. And the reason for that is that I think that Jamie FERREIRA successfully in her work defends Kierkegaard from the charge of ethical ACOSMISM. FERREIRA points to a variety of passages where Kierkegaard talks, well, like in Works of Love, page 78, love everyone in particular, but no one in partiality. It's a little complicated exactly what he means by that, but for FERREIRA, this means that we are attentive to the individual concrete needs and interests of individuals. Treating everyone with equal moral concern or respect doesn't mean treating people in all the same ways, because people have different needs. And so because Kierkegaard does have room for that kind of preferential treatment, we don't ignore the different needs that different people have, then in the strict sense of ethical ACOSMISM, Kierkegaard is not an ethical ACOSMist. And what is this distinctive concreteness, though, that we are loving differently when we love different people? Well, Kierkegaard isn't super clear about this, but I believe that the best way to understand this notion of distinctive concreteness in Kierkegaard and in FERREIRA is in terms of hyexeity, and specifically what I'm going to call a thick hyexeity. So a thin hyexeity is the bare metaphysical property of being this particular thing or individual. It's a thisness. This is the notion of hyexeity that is most common in contemporary metaphysics. In contrast with a thin hyexeity, there's what I'm calling a thick hyexeity. And I owe to John Hare the insight that the authors most known for the philosophers most known for their work on hyexeity, which is to say Duns Scotus and Immanuel Kant, their notion of hyexeity was more than just a bare thisness. Hyexeities, at least for persons, maybe not for things, but for persons, corresponded not only to an identity condition, this particular object, but they corresponded to potential manners of being in loving relationship with God. Every distinct person has a distinct thick hyexeity in the sense that they have the potential for a loving relationship with God, which is qualitatively different. Everyone's supposed to be in loving relationship with God, supposedly, but what that relationship looks like is going to be different based on who it is. And so I think this notion of thick hyexeity fits quite well with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard says, for example, that to love another person is to help that person to love God. And so if our main goal in loving other people is to help them realize that manner of loving God, which is unique to them as an individual, then the thing we wish for in the case of different people when we love them is different. We have a different goal for each person because the relationship they're supposed to be cultivating with God has a different character. And so I think that fits pretty well with Kierkegaard's viewpoint. The problem, though, is that this does not, while this does seem to get rid of ethical acosmism, we don't just treat everybody the same, it doesn't seem to make room for the particular kinds of relationships of preferential treatment that we most care about. The way in which I am and should be particularly concerned for the needs of my own children are not simply a matter of differences in concrete material needs. There seem to be certain moral obligations that come along with being, say, a parent or a spouse or a friend that aren't reducible simply to those individuals have different needs than others. And so even after we've gotten rid of ethical acosmism, there's still this issue of preferential relationships. And so the way that Jamie FERREIRA and John Lippitt go about trying to resolve this, to make room for preferential relationships, is to basically make preferential love something which is permissible if it is conditioned by neighborly love. And Lippitt calls this the God filter. And the basic idea is that we can love preferentially as long as we first and foremost love in a neighborly way. And in fact, the value of preferential love may consist in how it helps us cultivate the right moral attitudes and helps us cultivate neighborly love. And so the idea is that neighborly love is the determinant of moral duty, moral responsibility. And as long as our preferential love is within the bounds of morality, then it is all right, and those relationships can coexist. And there are definitely passages in Kierkegaard that sound like this one where Kierkegaard says that your wife or spouse should first and foremost be your neighbor, and only thereafter someone with a more narrowly defined special relationship with you. And so this moral conditioning of preferential love by neighborly love is how both FERREIRA and Lippitt mainly interpret Kierkegaard's various statements that God is the middle term in relations of love. And in fact, FERREIRA's interpretation so centers around this moral aspect. God provides the moral framework for the relationship between you and your beloved, that sometimes FERREIRA will substitute saying God's judgment is the middle term in the relationship rather than God's self. And so that's the general strategy employed by both FERREIRA and Lippitt. So we preserve in preferential love the ethical responsibilities involved in and learned from neighborly love, and we won't succumb to those two pitfalls that I described at the beginning. And so if we have this moral transformation of preferential love, that's sufficient to make it an instance of neighborly love. If we always keep neighborly love in the foreground of a relationship, it becomes possible to have distinct sorts of relationships with individual people without thereby excluding any others from the love that we owe them as neighbors. And so, yeah, that's just the idea that we can love preferentially as long as we first love neighborly, dutifully, etc. Now, this view has, whoops, I went one too far. This view has been criticized by a number of figures. KRISHEK and CARLSMITH are the ones I will discuss here. And, well, the first criticism is that an expression of something which is essentially P can't be not P. If one thing is essentially has some characteristic, then its manifestation or its expression can't lack that characteristic. And so the thought here is the only way we're going to get preferential love and neighborly love to coexist is not if one is a further expression of the other, because they have incompatible properties. One takes individual preference into consideration, one doesn't. And so instead, we need to think of these as two separate kinds of love that just happen at the same time, something like that. And to that, I add the further issue that I mentioned before, which is, what is it, if anything, which is supposed to make relationships of preferential love distinctively Christian in the way that Kierkegaard presumably wants? Yeah, and so when it comes to, well, to figure out what could make preferential love relationships distinctively Christian, we should first look at what makes neighborly love distinctively Christian. And the answer here with neighborly love is fairly straightforward, and most interpreters I've read seem to be on board with this and recognize this in the text. Kierkegaard seems to ground our duty to love in this neighborly way in the Christian doctrine of the incarnation. It is because fellowship between human beings was established by the incarnation that we owe this special kind of neighborly moral regard to all people belonging to the species that the divine Logos became incarnate as. And so, whereas for someone like Kant, the categorical imperative and the moral law is all based on our status as rational agents. Merely in virtue of being a rational agent, you are subject to the categorical imperative, you are an end in yourself, etc. Kierkegaard, at least as I read him, thinks that human beings are only contingently ends in themselves. Prior to the incarnation, the relationship between different human beings is really merely biological accident, something like that. But it is only once this fellowship has been established, this imprint of kinship between people that he talks about in works of love, that people become ends in themselves, and we have a new and different moral responsibility to love each other in this neighborly way. And so this is an example of how a type of love would get to be distinctively Christian. It's fairly straightforward. Its basis is a specific Christian doctrine. It is because of this Christian doctrine of the incarnation that neighborly love can and should exist. Well, how might we go about doing something similar for preferential love? And what I'm defending in this paper is the view that this can be done by thinking about Christian Trinitarian doctrines, which Kierkegaard is not super explicit about, but do seem to be in the background of his thought. And in fact, the prayer that is the introduction to works of love, it's kind of a preface or a epigraph. It is an overtly Trinitarian prayer in that it addresses, for example, God and the Spirit of God separately. And so let's see how this would work and why there's reason in Kierkegaard to go in this direction, and how it'll help us with that reconciliation of preferential and neighborly love. So the first thing is that Kierkegaard is pretty emphatic that the love relationship is supposed to be a triadic relationship. He says Christianity teaches that love is a relationship between man, God, man, not just man to man, person to person. And this is what he says he means when he says God is the middle term. He even goes so far as to call it a triangular relationship. Now, if a Christian philosopher is talking about love as a triangular relationship, it's pretty natural to think that the ideas about the Trinity are in the background of it, or at least may have informed it in some way. And so the second consideration has to do with self-denial. Now, KRISHEK objects to Kierkegaard's philosophy of love on the basis that it's too much self-denial. Self-denial, in one sense, means love seeks not its own. We don't care about our own interests or concerns or desires. or values when we love another person. It's entirely selfless in that sense. And that is one sense of self-denial. Kierkegaard does talk about self-denial in that way. But it is not the only sense of self-denial that we can find in Kierkegaard's text. There's also several places, I've just put a few here, where he defines self-denial in terms of becoming an instrument for God, the tool or conduit or mediating presence for conveying one person's love to another. And that sense of self-denial doesn't seem to exclude preferentiality, because it's not in terms of ignoring your own interests, it's in terms of this instrumental or mediating role. And so just because Kierkegaard says that Christian love is self-denial's love, that doesn't mean that all Christian love involves self-denial in that sense that KRISHEK objects to. So the third really interesting feature in works of love, which I'm using to support my position, is that God is not the only entity which he allows to be the middle term, the so-called middle term in relationships of love. There are a few passages where he says, like the one I have here on the slide, that either God or the neighbor can be the middle term. And that's really interesting, because suppose we went with the moral interpretation of FERREIRA and LIPPITT. God is the middle term in the sense that God is the moral judge or lawgiver who gives us the moral framework that we follow in loving another person. Well, let's substitute the neighbor. Would it make sense to talk about the neighbor as the lawgiver and judge, which informs how we love someone, for example, God? Seemingly not. It doesn't make sense to put the neighbor, it doesn't make sense to think of the neighbor as the middle term if what Kierkegaard means by the middle term is restricted to this moral sense of judge or lawgiver, because that's just not the role that the neighbor plays or should play. So this is what we have here with these three features I've identified. Kierkegaard describes the love relationship as triadic, with God as one participant, and there's this concept of self-denial where you are the conduit or tool to communicate one person's love to another. And then there's this idea that the roles can, as I say there, be subject to permutation. Who is the middle term can change depending on the context. And these three features, to me, point very strongly in the direction of understanding preferential love and neighborly love, both as instances of Trinitarian love. And so the reason that a preferential relationship would get to count as Christian and be distinctively Christian in the way that neighborly love is that it is like neighborly love in being an expression of the divine economy, the Trinitarian structure. So let's see in a little more detail how that works. So to do this, if we're trying to model our own relationships of love on the triadic relationship of love, which Christians believe occurs in the Trinity, then we should look at the two paradigmatic expressions of Trinitarian love in Christian theology. The first is the incarnation, which I mentioned a little bit about before, but it is very common for theologians to talk about the incarnation as God the Father giving God the Son to human beings through the mediating activity of the Holy Spirit, something like that. And depending on one's theological view, the purpose that this serves is for everyone. Christ's incarnation, death, resurrection occurs for all human beings, quite without any expectation of reward, indifferent it treats everyone the same in this way, and in that sense looks quite a lot like neighborly love. It's indiscriminate. in that sense. Now, if you are a Calvinist who believes in limited atonement, for example, who thinks that Christ dies only for the elect, then you may not agree with this characterization of the incarnation, but there's only so many theological rabbit holes I can go down here. But setting that aside, let's look at Pentecost as well. This is a further expression of divine love where the role of the Son changes. Rather than being the gift, the Son becomes the giver. And here, it is not being given to all human beings without distinction, without regard for reciprocity. It is a gift given to those particular individuals who have entered some kind of relationship with God, specifically the ecclesial or ecclesiastical relationship. And so I see in that a model of preferential love. And so I think that model, it would be very natural for Kierkegaard to apply that in the context of human love relationships. When we love preferentially, we are using God as the instrument by which we express our love for the beloved. And that's really the opposite of what we do when we're engaged in neighborly love, where we become God's instrument and convey a love that doesn't have us as the origin. We are not the gift. God is the gift. Like Kierkegaard said, to love another person is to help them love God, to cultivate that relationship. So when it comes to neighborly love, we are, in a sense, giving the gift of God to others, whereas in relationships of preferential love, we are giving the further gift of ourselves. And while there is a moral obligation to do the former, we owe it to everyone, according to Kierkegaard, to bring them closer to God. There's no corresponding moral duty to bring everyone close to ourselves. We do not owe that to all people in the same way that we owe the first. And so how does this apply to the question of how many kinds of love there are? Well, it all depends on what we mean by kind. And there are passages where Kierkegaard says, basically, Christianity only recognizes one kind of love. Very interestingly, though, those passages don't say that kind of love is neighborly. He calls it here spiritual love. There's only one kind of love, spiritual love. Now, with Kierkegaard, it's always a little difficult to tell when he's coining a technical term and when he's just speaking more loosely or metaphorically. But it's still, I think, telling that in the places where he talks about there being one kind of love, he doesn't identify it with neighborly love, even though neighborly love is the main topic of discussion in works of love. So what is this spiritual love? Well, I suggest we understand that as Trinitarian love, and we understand neighborly love and preferential love as equal and different expressions of spiritual love, because they follow, because they are both modeled on the Trinitarian structure. And so any relationship, including those of preferential concern, can have a distinctively Christian character if they are conditioned in this way, if they are structured in this way. Every relationship is triadic in that it involves us, our beloved, and God. But what distinguishes neighborly love relations from preferential love relations is who is the gift, and who is mediating the gift, who's the giver and who's the gift. So that's it. How much time do I have? Sorry, you're muted.
Not much, but if you feel like you would like to add 2-3 minutes to make your point or emphasize something, yeah, you're free to go.
I will mention that how one thinks of Pentecost in relation to the incarnation will depend on, again, on some denominational theological differences. For example, if you're Eastern Orthodox, you think of the processions a little differently than you do in the Catholic Church. I think the view that I'm presenting is neutral between those. It's entirely possible that it's not. And one thing that I would particularly welcome in your questions or comments is how we can bring other works of Kierkegaard to bear on the model that I'm suggesting, because my discussion has centered largely around works of love. I have looked through his other works for Trinitarian motifs. They're there, but it's not really clear to me what role they serve or don't serve. And so I would certainly welcome insight from other works of Kierkegaard with which I am personally less familiar. And so I guess I can summarize by saying this. On my interpretation, to say that God is love's middle term is that God is the source of love because God is love. And this approach lets us take that a lot more literally than LIPPITT and FERREIRA do in merely making God this sort of lawgiver or governor or moral judge. And I think that's important for Kierkegaard because in either or, he distinguishes between the God of Christianity and Eros from Greco-Roman tradition. And he describes Eros as being the God of love who is not in love himself. And he puts that in contrast with the Christian God who is the God of love, but is in love, God's self. And so that to me suggests that it's really important that God not just be a moral framework, but be an active participant in the kind of love that he thinks we are supposed to cultivate and practice. I will mention Jamie Ferreira doesn't really like the idea of God being an active participant, precisely because when you introduce this idea of a conduit or an instrument, that seems to be treating someone not as an end in themselves, but as a means to an end. Like, you know, God is using us as a tool for conveying love to others or something like that. I understand that concern, but it does seem to be something that Kierkegaard is on board with. To talk about self-denial so frequently in terms that involve becoming a tool or a instrument for God seems to imply exactly that. But I don't think we need to understand that in a negative way, because Kierkegaard also talks about the one who becomes a tool for God being God's co-worker. And that's a sense of cooperation and collective action, which maybe doesn't have the same suggestion of treating someone merely as a means to an end.